Good morning. Welcome to Counterpoints. We still do not have intro music. We promise we're going to get on that very soon. Should we set a deadline?
No.
No, let's not set a deadline because we will miss the deadline.
It's too much pressure.
We're definitely going to do it. I'm Ryan Grimm. This is Emily Jashinsky. We've got a lot to get into.
That's right.
We got war in Ukraine expanding. But first, in Georgia, the end of the midterms is coming. And potentially, maybe, I'm curious for your take on this, the end of an era. Let's put up A1 here. Raphael Warnock is heading into today with a small but significant polling lead,
right.
But also more importantly, with more than 1 million votes banked so far in Georgia, a significant lead among those votes. We don't know how those people voted, but we know what party they're in, and we'll talk about this later. 52% of the votes in so far are Democrats, 39% are Republicans, the rest independents, and we know in the polls he's winning independents, which means Herschel Walker on Election Day would have to win that day's turnout by something like 17%.
And if you look at the polls, this is just polls as of Monday. Warnock +5, Warnock +5, Warnock +3, Warnock +4, Warnock +5, Warnock +2. If you go to polls from Friday, Warnock +4, Warnock +3. I'm not seeing any.
Put up A2 here.
Not since November 7th am I seeing a poll that has Herschel Walker in the lead on RCP's aggregation.
Right, and as a result, Larry Sabato's crystal ball moved it over to lean Democrat. Now, polls are often wrong, but what you want to do is you want to combine the polling data that you get with other inputs. And one of those inputs being votes that have already been cast, and another being rally sizes, all the intangibles. And you're not, this is something conservatives have been frustrated with Walker about, right? He kind of took off. Like, there's only a month of the runoff. But on a bunch of those weekends, he was just kind of MIA.
Yeah, so, I mean, yes, and 1.9 million votes have already been cast, which is pretty shocking. That's a record for Georgia. They've had about 300,000 people voting early every day in recent days. I mean, that's just an
Whatever
insane
Jim Crow
number.
2.0 did, it did not manage to, stop people from voting.
Well, and I believe Brian Kemp actually cut early voting days from 17 to 5, which, again, I mean, we're talking about 1.9 million in, and I want to give some perspective on those numbers because they're really shocking. The total number of votes that were cast in the 2018 midterm and the 2022 midterm before the runoff was 3.948 and 3.961 respectively. So about 4 million votes cast. 2 million have already been cast early. In the 2021 runoff, there were about 4.5 million votes cast.
Yeah.
Again, 2 million of those votes are already in. As you mentioned, Ryan, we have the polling, but we also have the breakdown of voters that have already come and cast their ballots. That number clearly favors Democrats by a margin of 52 to 39. So Herschel Walker was a Trump sort of suggested candidate. Some Georgia Republicans in the party probably would have preferred someone else. But it looks like Herschel's going to lose.
And what does this say about Trump? Like, is this a Georgia-specific thing that Georgia is going to continue to be for however long a kind of a red state where Republicans are in control on the state level? They can gerrymander all of those state legislative seats. They can keep winning the governor's mansion. But on the federal level and the presidential level, is it just becoming a blue state, or is there something more specific to Trump here?
There's something more specific to Trump here, specifically if you look at Brian Kemp, the numbers that Brian Kemp put up on election night. He beat Stacey Abrams, who I would consider a pretty bad candidate, by a healthy margin. He got 53.4% of the vote, 2.1 million votes. Stacey Abrams got about 46% of the vote. That's a pretty healthy margin there, about 7 points, easy victory, whereas Walker wouldn't even come. Right. And so you could say that that's a candidate quality issue. You could say it's a Trump issue. I think both of those questions are correct. Now, Kemp had fallen out of favor with Trump pretty famously over overturning Georgia's results in 2020. So it is, I think, very telling that Trump, a very high-profile Trump enemy, or a Trump-appointed enemy like Brian Kemp, who we have an ad, I think, from Walker that shows Kemp giving his support. If that tells you anything, that's been running over the course of the midterms, he did well.
Right. Oh, and if you want to put up A3, that's the website that has these early voting numbers. You can check it out yourself. It's targetearly.targetsmart.com, and it's a Democratic data firm that is able to tell which votes have been cast and whether or not that person is registered as a Democrat, Independent, or Republican. You can fiddle around with all the numbers on their site, but no amount of fiddling makes it any better for Walker. But so the numbers you're talking about, that means that about 200,000 plus Republicans went to the polls on Election Day, cast a ballot for Kemp, and then either voted for Warnock, a write-in, a Libertarian candidate, or didn't vote at all. Just left it blank.
Right.
And if you have a sizable enough number of those people, is that a signal about Trump's kind of drag on the party nationally, or is there something unique about Georgia because of his history there, of his fight with Kemp, his perfect phone call where you say, I need 11, I don't care how you do it, just get me 11,000 votes, just get it done. And then the Ravensburger leaks the audio of the phone call. He then, barnstorms the state practically for Democrats in the 21 runoff, helping both Warnock and Ossoff win. And I say for Democrats because he set up the $2,000 check fiasco for Republicans. Like after they signed the $600 checks, Trump's like, hey, why don't you do 2,000? Democrats are like, great, do 2,000. And then Warnock and Ossoff ran on, make it 2,000. But then also he was telling everybody that it was rigged and there's no point in voting. So Trump did so much to hurt Georgia Republicans in 2020. Is he more toxic there, or is he equally toxic around the country? And this is going to be a drag on him, despite the fact that, let's be honest, he's still polling ahead of Ron DeSantis. He's still, or not in every poll, but he's still Trump. But how much of a drag is this on him?
So if you look at the numbers, about 30% of people nationwide say they're more of Republican voters, say they're more loyal to Donald Trump than the Republican Party. And that number has actually shifted recently in favor of the Republican Party and less in favor of Donald Trump. So that means the amount of people who say they're favorable to Donald Trump and not just the Republican Party over the Republican Party has decreased, while people who say they're loyal to the party over Trump has changed. And so that is, I think, a really important thing to keep in mind, because there's this hardened faction of the electorate for very good reasons that supports Donald Trump and Donald Trump only, or Donald Trump above the Republican Party. And that's a faction of the electorate that really matters. And I think that might be a faction of the electorate that doesn't go out and vote, let alone vote for Herschel Walker, because they just don't trust the results. So as opposed to it being that Trump is uniquely toxic in Georgia, I would say it's possible that you just have Trump voters who don't trust the election, even though Kemp ushered in those electoral reforms that were decried as Jim Crow 2.0. Right. You can go down the list. It seems entirely possible to me that Walker's results may actually be a glimpse into that what happens when you have that remaining faction of Trump voters who won't support Kemp and just won't vote, period. Like maybe they're just straight
maybe only
up.
Trump can get them out.
Right, exactly. And that's a problem for Republicans around the country because you can't run Dr. Oz in Erie County and expect to win the same margins as Donald Trump with Dr. Oz. You can't do it. And so, again, for Republicans, it's about finding that sweet spot that right now, electorally, mathematically, Ron DeSantis has done it, but it's going to be difficult. I mean, I don't think you can run Brian Kemp for president. That's not going to be, I think, the ticket that a lot of people get behind. So that's a sweet spot that's incredibly elusive.
Speaking of this Republican sweet spot, Glenn Youngkin did not campaign in Georgia, despite Republicans hoping that he would. Does he come out of this? And we could put up A4, which is the polling numbers that Emily talked about. All those blues you see over there on the right are the polls coming in for Raphael Warnock, and obviously Youngkin has a 538.com up on his toolbar there. So he sees this and he's like, you know what, Herschel, I think you're all right on your own. Not gonna come down there. So does he come out of this looking better than he did ahead of time? Like, is that where Is that the analysis Republicans are going to come to?
I think they're definitely looking at Youngkin and DeSantis as people who were able to get that coalition together of what they see as parents, sort of anti-woke independents, but not turn off people by being, what does Biden say, ultra MAGA, hardcore MAGA, whatever it is. And that's sort of what people see it as, although DeSantis has been pretty hardcore MAGA, even though there's sort of been, Trump has been attacking him recently. But also another thing to keep in mind here, if we put A5 up, we're talking about $80 million that have been spent just in this runoff. That's a truly remarkable number. 79 million into airtime in the runoff. Just unbelievable number. And people in Georgia right now are also debating what to do with their elections going forward, because the runoff tacks on weeks to an exhausting election season and makes them spend, I think it's like $75 million in election costs for a runoff.
Really?
Yeah, state election costs.
Oh, because you got to send the envelopes back out.
It's a lot.
You got the employees to count them again, and
right. So that's another thing to look for into the future. And I think we should go ahead and just for a taste of what that airtime has looked like, where that $79 million in just a few weeks has gone. Let's roll a couple of their ads. A couple ads from we'll roll an ad from Warnock and then from Walker, or maybe it's the other way around, and just get a taste of what people in Georgia have been seeing. Let's roll A6.
Character is what you do when nobody's watching.
And Warnock thought no one was watching when his ex-wife called police to report his abuse.
And he's a great actor.
And Warnock thought no one was watching when he evicted poor people from their homes.
He really evicted for $119. Treat me like
Character is what you do.
When nobody's watching, you find out who Reverend Warnock really is.
I'm Herschel Walker, and I approve this message.
New details tonight about accusations that continue to follow Senate candidate Herschel Walker.
Walker's ex-wife, Cindy Grossman, got a protective order against him. Her sister submitted an affidavit saying he stated unequivocally that he was going to shoot my sister, Cindy.
Put the gun to my temple.
He had the gun right to your head? What did he say?
I'm gonna blow your effing brains out.
Over the years, 2 other women have accused the Senate candidate of threats.
A woman telling police she was very frightened of Walker, making threats to her and having her house watched. In another incident, a police report shows a woman who was involved in a relationship with Walker said he told her that he was going to blow her head off.
At one point, with a loaded pistol in his car, he admits he set out to kill a man over a trivial business dispute.
Oh, yeah, I did want to kill her. Yeah, I did.
He says he doesn't remember a lot of details of these.
He may not, but I certainly do.
capping it off with Walker being like, yeah, I wanted to kill him.
Yeah.
I feel like the first ad, which is the hit on Warnock, is so deeply undermined by the last 3 seconds, which is, I'm Herschel Walker. And I approve this message. Because then you're like, oh, okay, well, if it's a question of character, you could be like, let me find out more about what happened with Warnock and his ex-wife. Let me see who I agree with or disagree with in this dispute. And then you're like, oh, but if it's a question of character between Walker and Warnock, that's not terrain that Republicans want to be fighting on. They want to say, forget character. What matters is how you're going to vote in the Senate and what your kind of political values are. Mm-hmm. Because if it's going to be on character, there aren't many people that would lose to Herschel Walker in Georgia.
Well, I think it's fundamentally something that can also neutralize, though, the character question. I think that's probably part of the strategy here. And Herschel Walker is loved in Georgia by many, many people just for his athletic career.
He's an icon.
Right, yeah, exactly. And so, I mean, I think a lot of people do admire champion athletes. Now, whether that means they want to put them in the Senate, if they seem to have other character issues that come out over the course of the campaign, I don't know. But it is one of those things that could potentially depress independent turnout for Warnock to say, hey, look, he's saying that he's going to be the man of integrity and character that gets into the office, and you have to block Herschel Walker from getting into the office. But if you think, hey, maybe these two guys are both kind of, lame, maybe they're both losers, then maybe you stay home. And what's another interesting thing is just this $80 million runoff has been nasty. Basically what you noticed in both of those ads, and this had come out before just the runoff, but allegations of domestic abuse. Warnock's ex-wife alleges that he ran over her foot with a car. They're in a nasty custody battle, so he has problems with that as well. And there are many, many allegations of abuse against Herschel Walker. He said that he's had mental illness. He's actually copped to a lot of bad stuff that he's done in his past, which has been an interesting strategy. But it's just really been a nasty one.
And the Warnock one was an issue in the 2020 election. The police report came out. Basically, he and his ex-wife were having a fight near the car.
Right.
He backed the car up. She claims that the car ran over her toe. The police said that they saw no evidence of any injuries, and so didn't do anything at the time. And I think that kind of helped Warnock put it behind him. And nobody wants to say, well, I almost ran over my wife. Once you're in that, it's not good. But like I said, compared to he put a gun to my temple and said he was going to pull the trigger, and then him saying, yeah, I wanted to kill that guy, and multiple other women also saying that he had made these severe, traumatizing threats.
Although the last thing I'll say, maybe we can pop A8 up on the screen. This is a quote from Herschel Walker.
Oh my God, so good.
He says he hasn't seen any lack of enthusiasm from voters. This is a quote from Politico. Walker said, "They're not less motivated because they know right now that the House will be even, so they don't want to understand what is happening right now. You get the House, you get the committees, you get all the committees even. They just stall things within there. So if we keep a check on Joe Biden, we're just going to keep a check on him," Walker said. Now, it sounds there like he thinks he's running for the House, or he's mixing up the words House and Senate. I don't know. But the point I was going to raise is there's a difference, I think, in Warnock's contrast and Walker's contrast, in that Herschel Walker isn't running as an erudite statesman. Whereas Warnock is running as a sort of, he's running on his religious credentials. He's running.
Reverend at Martin Luther King's church. It's.
Right. And so with Herschel Walker, it's like, but it's all kind of baked into the cake. What are you going to say? He's a football player, and he is, has had a checkered past. Well, he'll tell you the same things.
Right. And so Friday, to pick up the thread we talked about there, audio emerges of him saying, "I live in Texas." He took a homestead exemption in Texas. He talked about making the decision to run for the race. I was going to say Georgia Senate, but it's not obvious. He knows he's running for Georgia Senate to run in the campaign from his Texas home. And now you add to it that maybe he's misspeaking here. But the funny thing is, you're not sure. You have to sit with the possibility that he thinks he's running for the House.
Yeah.
You can't immediately rule it out. And everybody watching it knows you can't immediately rule that out. And that's amazing. He might have been misspeaking. Maybe he thinks they're both called houses and he's going to the upper house and there's the lower house, something. But you're like, I would not bet my life that he doesn't think he's running for the House. Also, his point is also wrong, even on its own terms. Republicans already control the House. So one more seat in the House wouldn't actually help them. And Democrats have a majority in the Senate no matter what happens.
That's what was
race.
Confusing to me. It's that there wasn't even you could take it in the most charitable possible way, and it's still, the logic didn't check out with reality.
Yeah.
Or didn't match up to reality. But with Herschel Walker, it reminds me a lot, we were talking about this last week, of the runoff between Roy Moore and Doug Jones. And Roy Moore is a pretty different ballgame, but in the respect that there are Republicans who are single issue voters on pro-life issues. There are Republicans who are single issue voters right now on basically wokeness issues, if that's what we're going to call it. And what I would say is just basically these people are mostly warm bodies anyway. I think the public is increasingly aware of that. Someone is just a robot who's going to vote either the way the sort of anti-McConnell people want them to vote, or the anti-Schumer people, or the anti-Pelosi people want them to vote, or they're going to vote down the line with McConnell, with Schumer, with Pelosi, with McCarthy. And as long as you can determine which side of that they're on, you probably know what's going to happen, and you just need them to pull the lever.
And last point on these early voting numbers that you can fiddle around with, it looks like Warnock is up probably 15 points, like in the early vote to start. But if you look at youth vote, here's what's interesting. Youth vote, 18 to 29, made up almost 11% of the electorate on election day, which is a huge amount. Like that's well above what young people used to do, say 2014 and before. So far in the early vote, they're only 7.9%. And so there are two possibilities here. One, which is what I think, which is that young people procrastinate, and they also they're more likely to vote on election day if you only have a couple of weeks to vote. Or they're going to go back to their 2014 kind of turnout levels, and youth turnout will be way down. I don't think that's right. But if it's right, then Walker could be closer. And maybe only lose by a couple of points. If youth turnout on election day, surges and hits what it was during the general election, 10.9%, you could see a significant Warnock win, which would be kind of startling because, he only won by 30,000 votes in the general election.
Right.
So finding a way to go from 30,000 to winning by several hundred thousand is difficult in the same state a month apart, but Walker may have figured it out.
It's interesting to kind of hypothesize about what this race would have looked like had it been the determinative factor in control of the Senate. And again, it's not, and there's still $80 million that poured into it, because obviously that vote is extremely important either way. But, when Republicans sort of realized what wasn't at stake in Georgia, it does seem like, and I saw a quote in Politico from a GOP guy down in Georgia saying, it's like everybody's just kind of hoping for the best right now, but that's all you can do.
And it's so crazy to think that Mandela Barnes in Wisconsin only got a couple $1 million from the party and lost by like 20,000 votes. And that's also a Senate seat.
But again, we're looking at these numbers right now, and I think we don't have a poll that shows, a recent poll that shows Walker winning. Right. We have the early vote numbers that favor Democrats by a really sizable margin. And the polling in the last, 5+ years just really hasn't been great. So you never know. It's raining in Georgia. Who knows who that favors? Polls close at 7, but certainly here I think we're expecting a Warnock win.
Yeah, and results should be in by 9, 10 o'clock. We'll see.
We'll be watching. Let's move on to Ukraine. There's a lot of news on this front. Just in the last 24 hours, we're going to start with a video of Vladimir Putin driving across the Crimea Bridge. This happened on Monday. Let's roll right now. B2, the video of Putin.
Ремонтные работы в 9 километрах отсюда.
Левая, я так понимаю, в рабочем состоянии, но тем не менее нужно она немножко все-таки пострадала. Надо довести ее до идеального состояния. Да?
Да, Владимир Ильич, она в ограниченно работоспособном состоянии.
The bridge was hit by a truck bomb on October 8th. This was a surprise visit from Putin. Now, on Monday also, the New York Times has this sentence in its report on what happened between Ukraine and Russia. Quote, Ukraine executed its most brazen attack into Russian territory in the 9-month-old war on Monday, targeting 2 military bases hundreds of miles inside the country using unmanned drones, according to the Russian defense ministry and to a senior Ukrainian official. They got within 100 miles of Moscow with one of those. Ryan, this is huge news. I think the New York Times is correct to say it's the most brazen attack into Russian territory. What did you make of the development yesterday?
Just monster escalation, it seems like. What Ukraine did here is attacked the airfields from which Russia has been launching a lot of its attacks. What I would say are kind of illegal, war crime attacks on the kind of infrastructure, the civilian infrastructure of Ukraine heading into the winter, trying to plunge the country into cold and darkness throughout the long Ukrainian winter. And so they sent drones to these 2 air bases, one of them Engels Airfield, I guess, after Frederick Engels. It's a Soviet-era name. It's near, I guess, the town of Engels. So they didn't rename that. Although there's still love for Engels over there.
Yeah. It's a base in the south of Russia.
Right, and one of them was 100 miles away from Moscow. Russia claims that they were able to shoot down that drone, but that as it crashed, it ended up killing a couple of servicemen and hitting, like, I think, one aircraft.
Yeah, 2 planes. It had slightly damaged 2 planes. The fall of the Soviet-era jet drones, that's what the New York Times is reporting, that Russia said were shot down. Slightly damaged 2 planes, and according to Russia, killed 3 servicemen and wounded 4 others. And again, we're talking 300 miles from the Ukrainian border. One of these is 100 miles from Moscow. You can see there in the New York Times headline, it says, deep into Russia, deep in Russia. And I think that's absolutely correct. Ryan, the Putin video happening, I mean, that visit happened earlier on Monday. What do you make of both of these things happening on the same day?
I thought Putin would use a horse, like ride a horse across the bridge. Isn't that kind of his thing? No, I mean, so that's his flex to try to assure the Russian public that that this is not going backwards for him. He's also there were reports in the Post of the Times that that Putin is building up bases in Mariupol, trying to strengthen his hold on key parts of Ukraine that they're currently occupying, even as they lose ground elsewhere around the country. This comes at the now. I think it's useful for de-escalation that Ukraine did not use kind of American weapons. Mm-hmm. If Ukraine had used American drones or American weapons, you'd have Russia calling an attack by NATO, and then who knows what that response would be. I think it shows that Ukraine isn't really afraid of Russia escalating inside Ukraine, like Russia, and that so. Russia has played the card of humanitarian catastrophe by constantly attacking all of these power plants and other civilian elements of infrastructure. Then they don't have a threat that they're going to go that much more brutal. Because at the beginning of the conflict, you kept hearing people who were sympathetic to the Russian side saying, well, they have gloves on still. Mm-hmm. That they could really be punishing Ukraine. And they're not so far. So you don't do this or don't do that. Now that they're trying to freeze everybody to death over there, then that takes away a kind of a stick. So I guess Ukraine is in a we don't have anything to lose frame. Now certainly they do. There are still nuclear weapons that Russia holds, and the world has plenty to lose in a nuclear fireball, right, if this continued to escalate. So to me, it shows the importance of actually getting this thing to the negotiating table, because you don't know. Any morning you could wake up with somebody stepping over a line that can't be walked back.
Right. Absolutely. And on that note, actually, did you read the national interest story? We have a graphic of it. We have a tear sheet of it that we can put up right now. It was about what a potential peace proposal might look like. Did you get a chance to take a look?
No. What did you? So tell me about this.
Well, basically, what the sort of contours of a legitimate proposal being passed around might be. And that is something that really should have been a conversation months and months and months and months ago. Obviously, there are some people who have been talking about it for months and months and months. But it's basically like 7-year waiting period for Ukraine to enter NATO, which, that doesn't really solve any problems at all, actually. And it may be something that can everyone calls off their dogs in the moment. But also, I think this would necessarily involve ceding some territory to Russia. Mm-hmm. Which is a non-starter for Zelensky, for a lot of people in the American government. But it has to, you have to have something on the table in order to de-escalate.
Right, and it goes back to this rhetoric where we've set Zelensky up, I think, to be humiliated in the way that the U.S. has consistently said that, Zelensky and the Ukrainians are the ones that are, fighting on behalf of and negotiating on behalf of Ukrainians, and the United States is just here to help. Mm-hmm. Like that has been our posture the entire time. The United States, I maybe there's a time throughout our history where we have stuck by our word on something. I can't think of it offhand, Maybe somebody out there can find an example. But people who have relied on the word of the United States have consistently lost. And so the idea that an empire like the United States was ever going to indefinitely turn over its foreign policy to a smaller country like Ukraine that is funding and backing in this war against Russia was always absurd. It's a nice thought when sovereignty and self-determination. These are nice thoughts ever since Woodrow Wilson proposed them. They've been lies ever since Woodrow Wilson proposed them. Every country who believed that Woodrow Wilson was serious about their own self-determination, paid the price of our betrayal. These are words. These are not things that the United States is going to act on indefinitely. And so, a peace deal, it is not going to be only up to Ukraine.
Yeah, and here's from National Interest. They say a proposal that's transmitted through a Ukrainian contact has been drawn up by, quote, some Western countries, which is a euphemism for the United States, they put in parentheses, and has been initially accepted by the Ukrainians. The cards on the table for Russia make interesting reading. In this agreement, there's a complete cessation of hostilities and a withdrawal of troops from Ukraine by Russia. The thorny question of NATO will be postponed, and Ukraine will join after a minimum period of 7 years. 100-kilometer-wide security zone will run along the borders of Russia, Ukraine, and Belarus, and will be policed by 6 Western countries. Crimea will become a neutral area, and the Russian Navy would leave the Black Sea. They say there, in the National Interest that has initially been accepted by the Ukrainians, Crimea becoming a neutral area and the withdrawal of troops from Ukraine, I don't see Russia doing that. I don't see Crimea becoming a neutral area from the Ukrainian perspective. So the idea that that's sort of been initially accepted by Ukrainians is pretty surprising to me.
And then the question is, or else what?
Right.
So if the United States, if let's say, hypothetically, the United States is offering some type of a deal like this, the question then, or what? Like what happens if Russia does not accept the terms of this deal? And it says, according to this, the Ukrainians are like, okay, we'll take this, like something along these lines will work. How much more support does the United States offer? And I don't know if we have the element for this here, but the Washington Post is reporting this morning that indefinite support for the war in Ukraine is steadily fading among the American public.
Yeah.
Now there might be enough support to last long enough to get to a place where Russia has to eventually capitulate, and there might not. There is a significant gap between kind of elite and Washington support for the war and public support for the war, and in that gap is the kind of gap of our democracy. Like when it comes to foreign policy, the American public gets some say, like they get to sort of like offer an opinion, but it's not democratically decided. Like foreign policy decisions are often bipartisan, even if one party would go slightly different direction than the other party. And so if the American public turns against the war, that doesn't mean that the war support stops.
Absolutely
now, eventually the weight of opposition can work its way kind of through the broken, rusty machinery of our democracy, but it takes many cycles.
And to wrap up, we started the segment with Putin driving over the Crimea Bridge. The Crimea Bridge, and National Interest said, this leaked peace deal, for what it's worth, is basically being rejected by Putin by the fact that he was continuing to bomb Ukrainian infrastructure. And then Ukraine retaliated, and Russia, by the way, retaliated back. So again, the idea that there's a plausible peace deal being circulated by both sides right now, it's very important to have terms on the table, period. But the idea that we are meaningfully close to an end, I think, is unfortunately, tragically elusive at the moment.
And you could at least say that calling Crimea neutral would be a win for Russia, because right now
he can claim it.
Right now it's called officially, legally Ukrainian territory that Russia has illegally annexed. And so, if they move it back to neutral, then that's arguably moving it in Russia's direction. That plus lack of prosecution. Maybe there's enough pressure on him that Putin can find some way to declare victory. I don't know.
Right.
But let's turn to Dr. Anthony Fauci, the transcript of his interview with, who was it, the Missouri AG?
He's been deposed in a lawsuit brought by the AGs, the attorney generals of both.
C1 here?
Yeah, so this is both Louisiana and Missouri. They have a lawsuit against the federal government, also against the Biden administration for allegedly colluding with social media companies to suppress speech. And Fauci was deposed, I believe, last week. Yesterday, the full transcript dropped, and it is long. I think it makes Fauci did not look great. This is AG Landry. He's saying in his press release, Fauci's recent deposition only confirmed what we already knew. Federal bureaucrats in collusion with social media companies watch and control not only what you think, but especially what you say. During no time in human history was this more obvious than during COVID-19, where social engineering tactics were used against the American public, not to limit your exposure to a virus, but to limit your exposure to information that did not fit within a government-sanctioned narrative. And you can see, if you read the full transcript, which is it's extremely long. He was deposed for a very long time.
Almost 500 pages or something.
Yeah, it was hours and hours of deposition on Fauci's behalf. You can see, I mean, Fauci uses the term "I do not recall," the famous term "I do not recall," many, many, many times. He leans on that very, very heavily. I do not recall, I do not recall. And again, that's very common of people in positions of power whenever they're deposed. The American public is well aware of that. And in a long deposition, you would imagine there would be some "I do not recalls," but I want to put up the statement that we got from Justin Goodman with White Coat Waste Project. That's going to be, let's pop that up on the screen, because Justin, I reached out to him last night. White Coat Waste, we had him on the show a couple weeks back. They've been doing a lot of insanely good FOIA work and a lot of what we know about what the government knew in the early days of the pandemic has come from them. So Justin immediately gave the statement to us here at Counterpoints and said, what really jumped out at me from this deposition is that in the deposition, Fauci definitively states at numerous points that it is, quote, impossible that the animal experiments that he funded in Wuhan could have sparked the pandemic. At the same time, he claims he's only vaguely familiar with the project he was funding there, and that he barely knows the key players, including some of these scientists and people may be familiar with Peter Daszak and EcoHealth Alliance. And Fauci, Justin says, cannot have it both ways. Hopefully the incoming House GOP majority's promised COVID origins investigation can refresh his memory and get the truth. All right, Ryan, I think that is a really big tension for Fauci. And in the deposition, you can see him repeatedly saying, I'm vaguely familiar with Daszak, I'm vaguely familiar with the EcoHealth Alliance, but also is impossible. Impossible is what he's saying publicly, that the animal research here created the pandemic.
My favorite part was that he also doesn't know how to pronounce Daszak.
Yes.
Which I still don't. I've been reporting on the guy for 2 years.
Let's just go with Daszak.
Go with Daszak. Daszak says, the lawyer says, how do you say his name if you know? and Fauci says, I'm not sure. I think it's Daszak. I think so. But completely unhelpful transcript because it just spells the name. Like I need to go listen to the audio. And then he says, we've met once or twice.
But I don't know.
But I'm not sure if we've met. And then he says there's a picture of us at a scientific conference. And he rightly says, like, look, that happens a lot. I meet hundreds of people at scientific conferences. They're like, hey, it's Dr. Fauci. Let me get a picture. they snap a selfie. Years long later, they might start a pandemic. And then now all of a sudden you're getting blamed for the pandemic because this person snapped a selfie with you. But you're right that he consistently says, yes, it's true that NIAID funded EcoHealth Alliance, but this particular project, did we fund that particular one? What who knows?
Well, and they also get into a ridiculous debate about gain of function, and this is something that you've covered a lot about Fauci and the medical establishment being very cagey about what the actual definition of gain of function is, because that might mean the grant that was given to EcoHealth Alliance, a government grant given to EcoHealth Alliance that would have had to have been approved by Fauci. And he's saying in this deposition, it wasn't at, he doesn't remember, but he doesn't think it was at his level. It may have been a deputy, that it came across their desk, not his desk, something to that effect. That the money was going to something that was intentionally gain of function. There had been a federal cessation of funding for gain of function research, and he's basically concedes at one point in this deposition, one of the terms in the grant could mean amplifying the virus.
Certainly could.
Yeah.
And so I'll just read a little tiny bit of that. The lawyer says, so you refer to conditions under which such research should be done when you're generating potentially dangerous viruses. It's like, right. First of all, is that kind of research generally referred to as gain of function research? And here, I'll just stops. Gain of function this is Fauci. Gain of function is a very potentially misleading terminology.
Yes.
And that was one of the reasons why several years ago, outside groups, not the NIH, made the determination that they would much more strictly define the guardrails of experiments that would require additional oversight, and did away with the terminology gain of function because it can often be very confusing and misleading. So read between the lines of what he's saying there. In order to stave off government regulation, these outside organizations said that they were going to self-regulate, that they were going to police themselves, put up their own guardrails, and also, by the way, they were going to get rid of this pesky term, gain of function, so that if somebody comes asking, like, are you doing gain of function research over here? Well, there is no such thing really as gain of function research, and we've put up all of these guardrails.
Right.
And all of this giant debate is happening between 2012, 2013, 2014. Obama, to his great credit, I wasn't even following this at the time, clearly got a very good briefing on this issue and was like, you know what, this looks dangerous. And he paused all gain of function research. Not long after the pause was lifted, I guess the Trump campaign comes in, Trump administration comes in, and Fauci, who has 40 years of bureaucratic knife fighting experience, is like, oh, cool, new administration, new rules, I can get this lifted. To get it lifted, a couple years later, we have a pandemic. That alone does not prove anything, but the timeline is frightening. That if what is alleged to have happened in the Wuhan lab did actually spark the pandemic, it only took a couple of years of this risky research. We're still doing it, and we're doing it at a much greater clip around the world at this point.
We hosted a few months back, I think it was over the summer, a debate between someone at MIT and someone at Johns Hopkins on what gain of function is and if it's worth it. So that was a very clarifying conversation. So if folks are interested in that, they can check it out. That was back at the Hill. But it was fascinating to pit experts against each other, because this is a question experts disagree on. Now, I think most of the public is probably in our camp, Brian, that's like, no, right. Stop.
Yes, please.
And so to Justin's point, the House GOP, now that we know they'll have the majority, McCarthy has said, he's told me, he's told other people, that he absolutely will be investigating the origins of COVID. I think, though, that this deposition, which is hours long, hundreds of pages long, is a great glimpse into what that's going to look like if they try to get Fauci to testify. I don't think he has any fear of testifying. That's why he goes on every different show that'll have him. People, he wants to talk to people. He's arrogant to the point where he thinks he can explain away, that he can basically talk through any of these questions. So I don't know how productive it is to continue investigating, continue probing Fauci, because he doesn't admit to anything. He says, he'll get into these. At one point, the attorney basically says, stop going on tangents in the deposition, because it does seem to be an intentional sort of deflection technique where he's talking for a really long time and going in different directions in order to distract from one question or another. So if House Republicans want to get to the bottom of this, I know that Fauci is a headline grabber. I doubt that Fauci himself that you're going to get any productive lines of inquiry out of Fauci himself at this point, because he is ready to talk in circles around absolutely anyone without revealing pretty much anything.
All right. So let's move on to the Supreme Court.
Big case, potentially a landmark case in front of the Supreme Court. Oral arguments happened yesterday in the 303 Creative case, which I really think could be a landmark First Amendment case now that the balance of the court has shifted rightwards. Folks are expecting this to change what happened in the Masterpiece Cake Shop case, which a lot of people might remember. Jack Phillips, he's a Colorado baker, ended up in the Supreme Court because essentially he was being compelled legally to create what he sees as art, which would be the decoration of a cake, the baking of a cake, the decoration of a cake for causes like same-sex marriages that he didn't agree with. He said, I'll happily serve any customer. It doesn't matter race, sex, religion, sexual orientation. I will serve any customer. I can't create art that violates my values. So that ended up at the Supreme Court as to whether the government, for the sake of preventing discrimination, can compel him to do that. Lori Smith is now in front of the Supreme Court. She's also from Colorado, and she is doing the same thing, basically. She's a graphic designer, a website designer. So she's saying she doesn't want to create wedding websites for same-sex couples, and Colorado has that protective anti-discrimination law. That's what got Jack Phillips, ended up having the court case of Jack Phillips a masterpiece in the first place because of Colorado law. Ryan,
so what was the precise result of the wedding cake
it keeps
decision?
going back and forth.
Was the cake maker told that, because the law, I know the law was upheld, but there was some carve out for the cake maker or something?
Yeah, it's exactly that. It's not a clean cut. And that's what the right is hoping for in 303 Creative, that you would have a clean cut protection of conscience in this case.
So basically they carved out, they're like, all right, you don't have to make this particular cake.
Yeah, it was, and
but everybody else has to follow the law.
And Jack Phillips continues to get sued to do the same thing, to make the same types of cakes. And so it's one of those things where the right is hoping that there can be a more clear-cut protection in this case. And, you know, the oral arguments yesterday were interesting. Ryan, we both had a similar reaction just looking at some of the stuff as it goes down. Let's actually put, let's play the SOT D2 because we get the audio clips from the oral arguments, which is always fun. So here's one from yesterday.
In light of what Justice Kennedy wrote in Obergefell about honorable people who object to same-sex marriage, do you think it's fair to equate opposition to same-sex marriage with opposition to interracial marriage?
Yes, because in how the law applies, not in the discussion with folks, because of course honorable people have different views on this issue.
Yeah, and there was a lot of back and forth that went in some very strange hypotheticals were floated.
Black Santa.
Yes, and it went in. That was, you were hearing the voice of the Colorado Solicitor General Eric Olson, who was defending the comparison of race and sexual orientation. A lot of justices pushed him on that note, and the people who analyze courts and analyze these oral arguments seemed to think it was pretty clear where this decision was going to go, which was favoring Lori Smith. What did you make of what we heard from the court?
I mean, it does seem like they've got the votes, and they're gonna try to ram this through. The question will be how wide or narrow it is. But let's be clear here about what Lori Smith is asking for. Nobody has come to her and asked her to make a website for a same-sex marriage. Like, that hasn't happened yet, and it seems like she wants to make one of these sites where basically you fill in your name, your date, like when your wedding is. You can upload your photos. Like, you're basically the one that's doing the designing, but you know, she'll like make the fonts and the pretty part in the background. And she wants to put up on. She hasn't built this yet. She wants to build it. She wants to put up on her site that same-sex marriages need not apply. Like, it need not try to do business at her shop. Like, this is only for opposite sex couples. Like, she wants to be able to put that on her website rather than somebody having walked through the door and said, hey, we'd like a website. And so that takes it, that I think is where the landmark element comes in, because if she can do that, then why can't Facebook do that? Why can't Twitter do that? Why can't any other private company say that we don't allow same-sex couples to use our services?
But that's not what she's. I mean, she will serve any same-sex couple. She won't make a website for a same-sex wedding. She won't make a website that is specifically for the act of a wedding. And I would think.
But that's what her business is going to be.
Right. But that doesn't mean she wouldn't. Right. So, but it's the marriage itself. That doesn't mean that like she wouldn't design a website. And it's the same thing with Jack Phillips. It's not that he wouldn't make a cake or decorate a cake for somebody's birthday, whatever their sexual orientation happened to be, or whatever their race or sex or whatever it was. They will still be served. They happily will be served by the business. But the wedding itself, if it violates your religious values. And that's why I think this case is so interesting, because this is a really fundamental question about the First Amendment. And you're right that, like, I actually talked to her a few months back, and that was one of the things that I was getting at is, what is taking this to court? Where is this going and why? And the Jack Phillips case it really did shake a lot of Christians in Colorado who said, we're just trying to operate businesses here and follow our values at the same time. And you've heard similar cases like this come up from Muslim businesses, from Orthodox Jewish businesses, and it's becoming a real point of tension in society. And I think that's why a case like this and somebody like Lori Smith is saying, I want to, whatever you think of the motivation to seek the protection, the protection in and of itself is a pretty big tension point in the country right now.
And it's the same one that the kind of diner owners in North Carolina in the 1960s were using, right? It was that it was the First Amendment right of somebody who owns a lunch counter to just serve whoever they want to serve.
Yeah, that's the Barry Goldwater argument too,
right,
who was very involved with the NAACP, who was saying it's not the federal government's responsibility to determine how a business owner wants to discriminate, which we have obviously rejected with the Civil Rights Act and in federal court since then. But that was the argument being made.
I think right, and so I think the Supreme Court, I think, still believes that. I don't think even this 6-3 majority would say that no, actually, a public accommodation like a diner can, in fact, is free to discriminate based on that. That's not speech. Like, that doesn't count as speech.
Yeah, you can't discriminate based on race.
Right.
Yeah.
But can you discriminate based on sexuality?
Well, and that's, again, where the Civil Rights Act was always a really interesting test case for this, because if somebody claims their religion is racist, right, they outright say, my religion discriminates based on race. Well, the federal government has stepped in and basically said, we don't care. If your religion says that you should be discriminating and segregating, if you have a pro-segregationist religious belief, you are not able to practice that as a business owner. In your private property, the federal government is stepping in. Now, I think that is a very, very reasonable, a very reasonable distinction. Now, in this case, what's happened is that our public opinion on same-sex marriage has shifted very, very quickly, and it's a similar sort of test point. But at the same time, I think it's pretty much within the boundaries of, she has a position on same-sex marriage that Barack Obama had about 10 years ago. Literally 10 years ago.
And I think it's fine to say that businesses should be able to choose what business they want to do. Like, if somebody comes into a T-shirt shop and wants a pornographic T-shirt made, a T-shirt shop can be like, no, that's not the kind of thing that we do. Or if it's a kind of if it's like let's say it's a right-wing T-shirt shop, they shouldn't have to make gun control like T-shirts. Or if it's a left-wing one, they shouldn't have to make AR-15 T-shirts. Like, I get that, but to say that an entire class of people, which are, gay people, are not entitled to use this product, I think is different. Now, I don't think that you should, force a poet to write a poem for a wedding that they don't support. I don't think you should force a harpist to play at one. Like, if you're an artist, that's one thing. You can pick and choose. Now,
but Jack Phillips sees his work as
although
art.
I don't think. No, let me take a harpist.
And so does Lori.
Let me take a harpist back. Like, I think a harpist. If you do wedding businesses, you should do all wedding businesses. within reason. If you're booked that day, you can't do it. Like you can turn down business, but to turn down business, well, no, I won't play harp at a gay marriage like that. That I think a gay wedding. I don't think is okay within the bounds. That's not your speech. That's just a service. So I don't.
But she sees it as her art, and then you get to this.
But she's already made. It's
the government.
It's like a fill in the blanks website. Like I think she needs to get over herself with like. Whether this is her speech. It's not her speech. It's not her wedding. It's their wedding. It's their love. Like, stop. It's not you. Like, so it's just your website.
You just agree that what she's doing in terms of website design is creative. And that, I think, so, but then the government is determining whether baking a cake is art. When Jack Phillips, who's been doing this for decades, sees it as art. He sees it as
and he won on
his
that
passion.
Grounds, right?
Yeah, and then, so again, this is the government coming in and drawing the line as to what constitutes art, what constitutes speech, what constitutes, I mean, like, all of these questions I think are good ones to work out, but my colleague David Harsanyi wrote a decent question. He was talking about, so he says, would Cole, who says the ACLU has been this nation's leading defender of free speech for more than a century, call for the state to intervene in the case of an evangelical customer who wants to compel a gay designer to create a website for an organization that wants to overturn same-sex marriage laws and preaches that acts of homosexuality are a mortal sin? And that's why, again, we get into this a lot with, like, evangelical Christians have a very particular cultural connotation right now, but this happens to people that are not just evangelical Christians. It happens to Muslims, it happens to Orthodox Jews, as we just were talking about. And if the protections, I think, are not enshrined, it will happen to other people. It will happen to people who are pro-LGBT and get pushed on this by people who are anti. And so I just think this protection in the sort of from the broader perspective is a worthwhile one. And I think just this discussion is a testament to how interesting these questions are and how fundamental they are to the way we function as a country.
And I wonder if the country can get to a place where the war is so thoroughly won on that question that if there are a couple businesses that don't want to do it, that it doesn't hamper people's ability to get it done, because throughout history there's always tension between overreach and how much you force people along. Like if you take like the French Revolution, where they basically just like annihilate the Catholic Church, like that ended up not working out so well for them eventually. And so if they had been a little bit more, if they had created more space, as they did later in the revolution, for people who were like, look, I'm not against the revolution, but we just want to keep our priests.
Yeah.
They were eventually like, okay, you know what, that's fine.
And that's a good point, because I think we're basically, I actually think we're pretty much there. And that's been the case with Jack Phillips. It's definitely the case with Lori Smith, and it's definitely the case with Baron Merrill Stutzman up in Washington State, a florist. There are plenty of options at the same price point in all of these places. What happens is these, in some cases, it's activists are intentionally pushing the question and intentionally trying to get it to the courts.
Which this one was, right?
How do you mean? Yes, yeah. This case basically from start to finish, yes. And again, we're working it out in the court. So, but to your point, pending this decision, but I think the good news is, customers can get the product that they're looking for at this stage in the country, regardless of where they fall on that question. There are people who will serve you. And I think it's hard for people in particularly LGBTQ community to feel comfortable in their gains at this point because of the backsliding that they're seeing from, say, like from the Fox News world. You're getting all of these kind of drag queen story hour panics being built up, and so I think it's like, while from the right, you guys look around and you're like, you guys won. What are you worried about? You've got it. Just let us have our little web design company here in peace. From their perspective, they're still under siege. And when both sides feel under siege, it's really hard for either to kind of reach a compromise, I think. Absolutely, and I think that's what we see when we get these kind of test cases making their way through the court system. So we'll continue to follow this one for sure. Now, on the question of people coming to agreement, perhaps your monologue today is going to get at something that people can come to agreement on.
There we go.
What's your point today, Ryan?
Ending this war in Yemen. So we can report today that Senator Bernie Sanders is planning to force a vote on a war powers resolution aimed at blocking U.S. support for the Saudi-led war in Yemen as soon as next week, he told my colleague at The Intercept, Dan Boguslaw. An agreement for a ceasefire in Yemen between the Saudi-led alliance and the Houthis, who are backed by Iran, expired October 1st, though both sides have tenuously maintained that peace. Now, backers of a war powers resolution say that a strong vote in the Senate in the lame duck will send a signal to Saudi Arabia that it does not have a free hand to restart hostilities, despite the Biden administration's more placating posture amid its hunt for lower oil prices. Anti-war advocates had become a bit frustrated that Sanders had until today not announced if and when he'd be moving forward with the vote, though it's fair to say that Sanders has been heavily occupied. He led the fight last week against forcing a contract on rail workers that they had democratically rejected, and he worked with House allies unsuccessfully to add 7 sick days to it. He's also fighting the effort to add Senator Joe Manchin's energy permitting reform to the National Defense Authorization Act. Now, a vote would not take significant floor time, though, and anti-war advocates have been pushing him hard privately to move ahead with the vote. The news that he's finally doing so will surely hearten those who've been pressuring him. Now, a war powers resolution is, quote, privileged in the Senate, which means that the sponsor of it can bring it to the floor for a vote without the need for approval by the chamber's leadership once a certain amount of time has elapsed. At that point, the resolution has what we call ripened, and the one sponsored by Sanders is now ripe, meaning it can come to the floor. On Wednesday, a coalition of groups pushing to end the war in Yemen planned to release a letter to Congress calling for a war powers resolution vote during the lame duck. And today, the House Foreign Affairs Committee holds a hearing on the issue. The House version of the war powers resolution is sponsored by outgoing Representative Peter DeFazio, and it needs the support of Representative Jim McGovern to get through the House Rules Committee. It's much easier to move the House version once the Senate version passes, if it does. The war between Russia and Ukraine, though, in which the U.S. has been supporting Ukraine without a declaration of war, may complicate the politics of the resolution because some of the language as applied to Yemen would appear to perhaps equally apply to the war in Ukraine, though, of course, Congress is never under any obligation to be consistent in their interpretation across countries. The resolution defines, quote, hostilities in a number of ways, including, quote, sharing intelligence for the purpose of enabling offensive coalition strikes and providing logistical support for offensive coalition strikes, including by providing maintenance or transferring spare parts to coalition members flying warplanes engaged in anti-Houthi bombings in Yemen, unquote. Now, that definition is legally safe in Ukraine, probably, since there's no evidence the U.S. is helping Ukraine target Russia inside Russia's own borders. Although we might be, it's not known, and there was just a major strike inside Russia's borders. If there's any evidence that the U.S. Participated in that, that could trigger that provision right there. But the second definition reads, quote, the assignment of United States armed forces, including of any civilian or military personnel of the Department of Defense, to command, coordinate, participate in the movement of, or accompany the regular or irregular military forces of the Saudi-led coalition forces in hostilities against the Houthis in Yemen, or in situations in which there exists an imminent threat that such coalition forces become engaged in such hostilities, unless and until the president has obtained specific statutory authorization in accordance with Section 8A of the War Powers Resolution, unquote. Now, as The Intercept has previously reported, the U.S. Special Operations personnel have indeed played an active role in Ukraine under a presidential covert action finding. Despite the ceasefire lapsing in February, though, the Saudis have yet to resume bombing. Anti-war advocates believe that the Saudi hesitation flows from a concern that opponents of the war in Washington would get an upper hand at the first report of civilian casualties from a renewed campaign of bombing in a war that has stretched on for some 7 years now. The Saudis continue to maintain a blockade of Yemen, strangling the country's economy and producing a humanitarian crisis of biblical proportions. And part of this, Emily, feels like fatigue on the part of the U.S., which supported this war under the Obama administration and then supported it and continued to support it under the Trump administration. Biden promised when he came into office that he was going to end the war. He then caveated it that he was going to end U.S. support for offensive operations. You would think...
Big caveat.
Except it shouldn't be, since Saudi Arabia is not in Yemen. Like, they're just bombing Yemen. But what Saudi Arabia has done is said, well, those are defensive operations because you know the Houthis are bombing our oil fields and they're bombing us from Yemen, so therefore we have to go there and bomb them. You know, just like we have a Defense Department that is, you know, after World War II, we switched it from the War Department to the Defense Department, and that's when we really started expanding our empire.
Offense.
Yes, that's how you knew we were about to pop off.
Yeah, in a way, the quarterback is on defense because he's preventing the defense from having to play.
Yeah, the best defense is a good offense.
That's right. Yeah. And the point you made about Ukraine is really interesting as well, because the Intercept reporting on covert actions happening in Russia. What are those covert defensive actions that you're putting people in Russia? I mean, again, you can make that case definitionally, and you know it might require some gymnastics. But yes, I can see how you would be defending your homeland and your allies. But it gets into this tit for tat tug of war over who's actually on offense, and that is not a question that you can solve without going back to like chicken or an egg, the literal end of World War II.
Well, yes, and the covert actions in Ukraine would seem consistent with that second definition of hostilities, even absent any evidence that they wouldn't have to show that there are covert actions, you know, inside Russia itself. Now, like I said, Congress could apply the law to Yemen and then just say, well, it doesn't apply the same way to Ukraine. But the question becomes, does Putin use it as an excuse for some type of escalation to say that, look, according to your own congressional definition, you're now engaged in hostilities with us over here, and so. But you could, I mean, I guess all you could do is you'd have to throw offensive in there also.
Well,
and then you're covered.
The nuclear order is genuinely very, very complicated in ways we haven't fully grappled with, because obviously the definition of offense and defense shifts from the traditional sense of war. Then when you have nuclear technology, when there basically are no borders between some of the biggest world powers that have ever existed, because they have the power to attack each other from a continent away with technology at the push of a button, essentially. And so we still haven't, I think, settled on appropriate definitions, appropriate terms for what offensive and defensive warfare looks like. Because if you're spying in Russia to prevent them from pushing the button, they want to prevent you from pushing the button too, from their perspective. And I wonder how much play. I wish the Republican Party were on a better page when it comes to this. Democrats aren't much better, slightly better. But how much traction do you think Bernie's going to be able to get?
So he told Bogus Law that he thinks he will have enough votes. Some of the advocates I've talked to are skeptical, but they're going to be in overdrive trying to whip support over the next week. It did get a majority vote support in 2019, back when it was I think Mike Lee and Bernie Sanders teamed up to do it, and then it also passed the House of Representatives. So I think it's going to be close, but anything above 40, I think, even sends a signal to Mohammed bin Salman that there is substantial opposition, and that matters because the Senate and the House have their hands on the purse strings, and so it's not just kind of their opinion; it's their take. It's backed up by cash. Now, if it did pass the Senate and the House, Biden would likely veto it, which would be embarrassing for Biden, because Biden has pledged that he's going to end the war in Yemen. Now here he would be vetoing a war powers resolution, asking him to do the thing that he's already said he's going to do. But all presidents are inclined to veto these things because they don't want to give up any of their own war-making, foreign policy making power. At that point, you would need 2/3 to override a veto, which I don't know anybody who thinks that they can get that at this point. Yeah. If they don't get it during the lame duck, advocates are saying it's good to get it now while Democrats are in power, but they don't think the possibility of getting it through a Republican House is completely foreclosed. No. What do you think?
I don't think it's completely foreclosed. I think it would be extremely difficult, and I mean, even getting it to the floor, I think would be extreme. It's one of the things that's like, well, do we need to vote on this?
And Paul Ryan actually changed the rules and made it harder to get these in the Senate, Bernie can just put it on the floor.
Right.
But in the House, thanks to a rule change that Paul Ryan made, that Pelosi hasn't completely undone, members don't have the possibility. So maybe that's something the Freedom Caucus should fight for in the rules package.
Hey, that's a good point.
You guys watching? Yeah, get the War Powers resolution back into the rules package.
I'm all for it. It's a matter of priorities, and you can come down to the right position, but if you don't prioritize it on your legislative agenda, it's not going to.
And you got to do it now because the negotiations over the rules are happening over the next 4 weeks.
Sounds good to me.
All right, get it done, Freedom Caucus. So, what's your point today?
Christmas time can be really lonely, whether we're in a pandemic or not. Thankfully, most people believe we're on the other side of COVID now, but ahead of Thanksgiving, economist Bryce Ward crunched some post-pandemic numbers for the Washington Post. Quote, "Our social lives were withering dramatically before COVID-19, Ward found. Between 2014 and 2019, he added, time spent with friends went down, and time spent alone went up by more than it did during the pandemic. More than it did during the pandemic." Ward was looking at the Census Bureau's American Time Use Survey. According to the data, right around 2014, weekly alone time started to increase significantly. As Ward notes, our average weekly time spent with friends had actually been stable in the years leading up to 2014. That time period is really critical when you dive deeper into the numbers. It was right around 2014 that adult social media use started to stabilize. According to Pew, the percentage of adults who say they use at least one social media site smoothed out starting in 2014, oddly enough. It's around 62%. Deloitte compared American time use in 2003 with 2017 and found we spent more time watching TV and less time working out. So we're spending more time alone, more time watching TV, less time with friends and family, and less time exercising. These numbers are complicated, sure, but that is obviously a recipe for cultural chaos, especially with big changes happening over short periods of time. So who's the culprit here? Stagnant wages, division, the sexual revolution, maybe a combination of everything? Culture versus economics is an age-old chicken or egg question. Earlier this year, Seth Stephens-Davidowitz did a good overview of what we know about that question in a New York Times essay. Quote, "A study of thousands of millionaires led by researchers at Harvard Business School did find a gain in happiness that kicks in when people's net worth rises above $8 million, he wrote, but the effect was small. A net worth of $8 million offers a boost of happiness that is roughly half as large as the happiness boost from being married. It's a little cheaper option." Arthur Brooks studies happiness full-time. Quote, "One of the greatest paradoxes in American life is that while on average existence has gotten more comfortable over time, happiness has fallen." He wrote that in The Atlantic back in 2020 and added, "According to the U.S. Census Bureau, average household income in the U.S. adjusted for inflation was higher in 2019 than has ever been recorded for every income quintile. And although income inequality has risen, this has not been mirrored by inequality in the consumption of goods and services." Meanwhile, domestic government services have increased significantly. For example, federal spending on education, training, employment, and social services increased from 2000 to 2019 by about 30% in inflation-adjusted terms. So if we shift back one more time, stay with me here, to Stephens-Davidowitz in the Times, we see what might explain this great paradox that Brooks has identified. Stephens-Davidowitz wrote, "The activities that make people happiest include sex, exercise, and gardening. People get a big happiness boost from being with a romantic partner or friends, but not from other people like colleagues," bad news, Ryan, bad news for me too, "children, or acquaintances. People are consistently happier when they are out in nature, particularly near a body of water, particularly when the scenery is beautiful." So on that note, yes, we also know Americans are having less sex now too. My old editor, Tim Carney, wrote a wonderful book on all of this a couple of years ago called Alienated America. Tim pointed partially at the rise of the gig economy over the last decade. Think Uber and Lyft and delivery services and even independent contractor jobs. Quote, "A hyper-individualized capitalism is currently taking us toward a world where workers are available when needed, but no lasting attachment is formed," wrote Carney. "Work can't form an institution of civil society because work is no longer a place or a company or colleagues. It's a series of gigs. With no lasting attachment and no long-term investment, young people are less likely to find mentorship and training. They're less likely to find the work stability that is fitting for family life. We all have agency as individuals. The right is correct about that. But it's also true that corporations are preying on our vulnerabilities in new and significant and specific ways. Consolidation of monopoly power is giving consumers less power to push back too. The government and big ed saddled generations with insane levels of student loan debt, amounts people say make them put off marriage and home ownership. By the way, we're also working more than we did in the past. This is a bleak economy, and it's a bleak culture with more alone time, less marriage, sex, and children. At least on that front, though, Brooks's paradox can become empowering if looked at from the right vantage point. The saga of the real workers has put on full display the corporate strategy of making normal life almost impossible for employees. The good news is we can say no to extra TV, no to toxic food, no to dating apps, no to Netflix, and no to more time alone. It's not easy at all to do that, and some of us definitely have a whole lot more free time than others. But with our spare time, whether it's a lot or just a little, we can go outside. We can date to marry. We can hang out with friends and family. There's no downplaying the importance of living wages and material stability. But while we fight the political class on that front, we can also push back in our own lives as well. It's definitely not easy, but in some very big ways, it is free. Ryan, the loneliness numbers before the pandemic, if you look at the chart in the Washington Post, is just incredibly striking. That spike between 2014 and 2019, which is a faster rate than what we saw even during the pandemic. What do you make of that?
What's happening in 2014 that would create that? But I think we can identify a lot of the kind of global pressures that are pushing up. Is there anything particular to that, to the mid-2010s?
Yeah, if you look at social media use, it's really interesting. In chart after chart, I was just going through tons of different numbers on this yesterday. And if you're watching this, I put some of them up on the screen and didn't read through them because there's so much. Right around 2013, 2014, you see a lot of really interesting numbers starting, like you see spikes in a lot of just different metrics of social media use. Spikes, or you see the leveling off, meaning everyone basically got on the same page in our culture at that point, and was using, like around 2014, you start to see a very steady line of social media use, right at like 62% of adults saying they're on at least one social network, and that had been growing and growing and growing every year with some dips, and then it levels off and keeps steadily increasing, but there's no jumping anymore right at 2014. It's almost like we decided around 2013, 2014 as a culture that this was what we had to do, and it became less of a, you remember when people used to be like, I'm not on the Facebook?
Right,
that's not for me. Like, you'll never get me on that.
Yeah, that was me.
No, yeah. Right. And then it just became, really, this probably sounds silly to boomers and older people, but if you're younger, this is why I think of it really as a monopoly. If you're not there, you are literally missing event pages for school, for especially in college. Like, that's how you, at least when I was in college, it's how you were RSVPing to things. So it's tough if you're not on it.
And around that same time, you started to see a rise in turmoil inside of organizations and institutions.
Interesting.
Which we've talked about a lot. And I wrote that really super overlong piece about it back in the summer. And I wonder if there's some link between people's loneliness and people's kind of the collapse of people's social bonds, and the way that organizations are becoming less manageable. And I think that could manifest in a couple of different ways. So Maurice Mitchell, who's the head of the Working Families Party, maybe we'll talk about this. I guess we're back on Thursday. He wrote a piece for kind of a trade publication for nonprofit and progressive advocacy organizations that is like getting passed around all over the place by people who work in the progressive and the nonprofit space, which basically is kind of a letter to the entire progressive movement, saying like we need to figure out what's wrong. Not what's wrong strategically with what we're doing, but like, why can't we build institutions? Why can't our organizations function? And one of the things he highlights is that staffers, and not just staffers, leadership management types too, see the workplace now as the place where they're going to get their fulfillment.
Yes,
They're human.
100%.
They're full human
Purpose.
fulfillment. They're not just purpose, but on top of that, care, friendship, camaraderie, healing, and Mitchell says you have to get that somewhere else.
Yep.
Like a workplace can't be that. But the problem is there's nowhere else to get it.
Yep.
So it's not that that's people's first choice.
That's fascinating.
It's like people didn't wake up and say, what I really want is a job where I can work through my mental health difficulties all day long. But there's nowhere else to work it through. People didn't say that they wanted a job so that they could have some social interaction.
And if you think about that in the context of the gig economy, of Uber drivers, delivery folks, that is, you get an Uber driver every once in a while, a delivery person who is just so friendly and curious and intrigued and wants to talk about your life, wants to talk about their kids, wants to talk about their family and their friends. And I know there are a lot of people who don't like that because they see it as very transactional, which in a literal sense it is. I mean, it's a business transaction and a business relationship. But in this context, and that's kind of what Tim is writing about, the gig economy, when you have all of these people that are in communities where the community ties, civic society has totally tattered, they're going to be looking in the workplace. And we become, it was just an intense separation, lack of connection, lack of compassion. And one of the interesting things, to your point, in Tim's book is that he found in the Republican primary in 2016, voters who went for Trump or communities that went for Trump overwhelmingly had less civil society. So the places that had tighter community bonds voted for other people. And so to your point about dysfunction in a community, in a workplace, yeah, I think it's absolutely true that as we get less happy, as we get more lonely and less happy, because those two things do go together, we get more desperate and lash out.
And what have people found in Q, for instance? Like community.
Online
and
communities.
In MAGA, like ultra MAGA. Like it's a community. They have nothing. They have no social bonds, creating humanity. There is no humanity without social bonds. And so that gets ripped apart, and then the MAGA can become like a community, and that's why it can develop into a movement, and why it has so much staying power too. Because you're not gonna, because if you don't have that, then you're back to the bleak antisocial existence you had before that.
And that's what's really counterproductive about so much of the patronizing language that comes from the political class and the media towards people who, I've talked about this before, have from my perspective, very rational, reasonable justifications for giving a middle finger to the political class by voting for Donald Trump, by supporting Donald Trump. But what's so counterproductive is the more that you talk to people like that. I mean, I'm just thinking of this Rick Wilson, Don Lemon segment on CNN from a couple of years ago where they were mocking Southern accents in just a very gross way, like, and connecting it with obviously like level of intellect. It was pretty gross. It wasn't funny. It was just gross. The more that people see that, the more they're going to be trying to look for community in those places where their desperation is heard and felt and shared. And so it's just wildly counterproductive to think that you can defeat Trump by mocking the worth of the people who voted for him, the value of people who voted for him. It's just gasoline on the fire.
And it makes me a little more sympathetic to the folks who have looked to workplaces, for this self-care and self-healing, whereas previously, it just seemed to me so transparent that this is not the place that you need to come for this. But when you think about it in the fuller context, that they just aren't able to get it anywhere else because our society is collapsing and crumbling before our eyes, then it's like, well, okay, it's still not actually the appropriate place, but I understand why your impulse is in that direction.
Yeah. A great example is it's really hard for people to find churches in the city. I've heard from so many people who just struggle to find a good community and a good place, no matter what religion, denomination you are, because it's it's hard out there to make connections now. And so that's just one example of like many institutions that I think are harder for people to access in a meaningful way.
Yeah. And actually, I think YouTube shows are developing communities, right?
A guy stopped me on the street yesterday, and he said that breaking points have been life-changing for him. And
that's better than making your workplace your community. At least this is a genuine social community.
Yeah.
Where people can interact with each other and have shared experiences together.
And Sagar and Crystal are getting a taste of that at the live show tonight. And
that's right.
They come back from those with basically exactly the same thing you're saying, that the community is really strong. And just obviously every time we say that, we have to also say thank you, because...
Are they in New York tonight?
I can't keep track of them.
They don't need to plug their shows. If you don't have a ticket, you're not going.
It's like Carmen San Diego.
Right?
Yeah,
they're doing New York and Boston. I'm not sure when. Which is why we're here and why we'll be here on Thursday.
That's right. We'll be here Thursday too.
And there'll be no Counterpoints Friday. Just Counterpoints Friday on Tuesday, Counterpoints Friday on Thursday, no Counterpoints Friday on Friday.
If it's any day other than Friday, it's Counterpoints Friday.
That's right. All right. Well, thank you, everybody. Have a great, not weekend.
Have a great Wednesday, because we'll be back here on Thursday.
See you then.